Hello and welcome to another SHM movie breakdown and review, and in this particular breakdown we are discussing a movie which could quite easily be overlooked due to, quite simply, its title. The film's called Frozen, but this is most definitely not a Disney movie. This movie came out in 2010, it had a relatively limited theatrical release, and it didn't do that well commercially. It only made just over $3 million, so it really didn't do that well. It was a relatively low-budget film, and it has three main characters. The entire cast is only about a dozen people, but there are three primary characters who you spend the story with, and they are played by Emma Bell, Shawn Ashmore, and Kevin Zegers. And basically the story is a relatively simple one, about three friends who get stuck on a ski lift and left there for various reasons. Now, I've mentioned before on this channel that I really like movies that do a lot with a little. Simple stories that manage to keep you both entertained and rooting for the characters. This film does a very good job of that, I would say. It's not the most mentally taxing or mind-bending film ever made, of course, and the acting isn't exactly Oscar-worthy, but it's an entertaining film, at least for a one-off watch, especially for rewatchability with friends, and it's just an interesting difference to more obvious choices in the thriller or semi-horror genre. Now, as far as the breakdown of the film, initially we're talking, of course, story and plot. And for the story and plot, the film, as I said, does quite a bit with a little. Now, the location doesn't change that much. Most of the time in the film is spent on this ski lift. But it actually manages to stay entertaining and interesting. The film is surprisingly not boring. Not to me, at least. And it very easily could have been. So overall, for the story and plot, I'm going to give Frozen a 7. It's not the most amazing story, but it manages to keep the little story that it has surprisingly interesting and entertaining. As far as the characters and their motivations, well, for a film like this, and for other films of a similar type that do a lot with a little, such as Rope and various others, it really does rely on the characters. And I would say that overall, that's actually pretty much the only thing that lets the film down slightly. The three characters, these three young people who are stuck on the ski lift, they're not really as good as they could have been. Now, they're not bad. I've certainly seen far worse acting and far more annoying characters. In fact, considering the circumstances and considering the age of the three characters, they're actually far less annoying than you'd expect them to be. But the characters aren't necessarily as interesting as in some other films which are set in one location with a small amount of characters, such as the aforementioned Rope and other films like 12 Angry Men. This film does rely on its characters, and the characters aren't that amazing. They're okay, they do a serviceable job of course, but they're not the most interesting or likeable of characters. They're not dislikable, but they're kind of middle of the line, really. So overall, for the characters and their motivations of course being pretty simple in this film, to get down from the ski lift, I'm going to give the film a 6. It's above the baseline of 5, but nothing too special. As far as the visuals and overall effects, well, in general, there aren't a huge amount of effects used in the film. Most of the visuals tend to be very similar because it's snowy, there's lots of trees, and they are, after all, stuck on a ski lift. So the visuals don't really change all that much throughout the film, not through the majority of it at least. As far as the effects, though, which I won't spoil, there are some, and they are actually very good. There are some cringe-worthy moments, and they're done very well. The effects are practical, which is nice to see, and when the effects are used, they are pretty good. There's just not enough of them to make it a really high-grade special effect film. So overall, for the overall look, which is a pretty crisp-looking film and has some nice scenery, I'm going to give it a 7. The effects are good when they are used, and the overall look is an interesting looking film, although a little bit on the repetitive side, but that can't really be helped due to the location. As far as the sound and music of the film, I'm going to give it a 6, because it's not really anything that stands out. The sounds in general are relatively minimal. It tends to be mostly wind noise, as you'd expect stuck up in a ski lift on a mountain. There are some other noises, but not much in general, and the music doesn't really stand out too much. It does what it needs to when it needs to, as most films do. So I'm going to give it a 6. And finally, for the rewatchability and entertainment factor, which, as I've mentioned before on the channel, is of course the most subjective to me personally and purely down to my opinion, I'm going to give the film a pretty reasonable 7. Because although it's not necessarily the kind of film that you'd want to rewatch over and over again, it's worth checking out at least once. It is an enjoyable film for what it is and for its budget, and it is an underappreciated film. It's the kind of film that you could very easily watch if you have a group of friends around. If you talk over the film, you're not really going to miss that much, and it's an interesting popcorn movie. So my overall score for this film is a pretty decent 3.3 out of 5, which is reasonably good considering that it didn't do amazingly well financially. It is, however, reasonably well received critically, which is surprising for a film of such a low budget and that didn't do very well. And my overall verdict for Frozen is, if you haven't checked it out, and it is very easy to overlook this film due to the far more popular Disney film of the same name, if you do get the chance to check it out, I would recommend it, because it's a very interesting film as a one-off watch, and it is a genuinely different type of thriller/horror film. But that's it overall for my breakdown and review of 2010's Frozen. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.